Good morning, everyone. I am Councillor Hugh Mason, Cabinet Member for Planning Policy and City Development. The usual housekeeping information. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room by the stairwells. Please assemble a Queen Victoria statue in Guildhall Square. If you signed in at the front desk, please sign out when leaving. Now, this meeting is being webcast to allow the public to attend remotely, and I think Councillor Dent is attending remotely. Good morning, Councillor Dent. Please be advised that the public seating area is not in view of the camera used to webcast this meeting. Everyone speaking will be on camera. Anybody can record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they do not wish to be recorded. Please use the microphones and remember to switch them off when you have finished. Now, the introductions around the table. I am Councillor Hugh Mason, Cabinet Member for Planning Policy.
Councillor Ross Simpson, Hilsey Ward. I'm relatively new, so yeah, bear with me.
Councillor Simon Bowsher, Conservative Group Spokesman, and I'm relatively old.
Yes, we've been here a long time. The member officers.
Good morning, I'm Ian Maguire, I'm Portsmouth Chief Planner.
Rachel Scott, Principal Policy Officer.
Lucy Howard, Head of Planning Policy.
Lisa Gallagher from Democratic Services.
And in the public gallery we have
Polly Murray, Senior Planning Policy Officer.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest which anybody has? Nope. Well, we come on then to the first item, which is a report. I intend to ask the officer to present the report. I shall then ask the group spokespeople for any questions that they may have. We'll then deal with any questions I may have, and then we'll decide what to do with the report. The first one is the Housing Delivery Test Action Plan, and Rachel Scott, Principal Planning Policy Planner, will present that. Rachel.
Thank you. The latest housing delivery test result for Portsmouth was 26%. That's down 38% from the previous year. And any authorities that score less than 75% must produce a housing delivery test action plan, apply a 20% buffer to 5-year land supply calculations, and apply the presumption in favour of sustainable development to planning applications. The housing delivery test action plan is a report you have before you today. The housing delivery test results are published annually. The most recent results, published in December 2024, cover the period from the 1st of April 2020 to the 31st of March 2023. So I would like to stress that we are talking about a period that is over 2 years in the past. The Housing Delivery Test Action Plan looks at reasons why housing delivery was low during that period and sets out ways to improve matters. There were various reasons for underdelivery in the period. The start of the period was affected by COVID-19. The final year of the period, staffing levels in the DM team has had some impact on the percentage of planning applications being determined on time. Local plan allocations have been slow to deliver, and the demolitions of 277 dwellings at Leamington House and Horatia House were counted in that period, with the completions there obviously yet to take place. Nutrient neutrality also affected planning applications during the period. Many of these issues have now been overcome. The effects of COVID-19 have largely subsided, and staffing levels in the DM team have been improved and have sped up the determination of planning applications. The local plan is progressing, and the local plan addendum will be consulted on in winter this year. A strategy has also been put in place to deal with the nitrates issue. But there's obviously always more that can be done, and to improve housing delivery in Portsmouth. So actions are set out in Appendix 1 of the Housing Delivery Test Action Plan to help address the issue. The key action that will help us achieve better results in the future will be to put in place a new local plan. This is because this impacts the target that we're assessed against for housing delivery test. Currently, we're measured against the standard method, which, because our local plan is more than 5 years old, and that figure is ever increasing. If we get our new local plan in place, we will be measured against the new housing target from that local plan, which will inevitably be lower than the standard method figure and will mean we'll be measured against a more realistic target. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take in alphabetical order, Councillor Bosher.
Thank you very much. Going through the report, I'll start with a small one if I can. 3.4.1, the table. It should be 503, not 500, I think.
Sorry,
The
I'm not
voting
sure
is
I'm
it
in
doesn't add up.
Yes,
Where are you looking, sorry?
table
Dwellings
5.
command.
Table 5.
Yeah.
So 49 plus 46 plus 48.
Okay. 501.
It's a minor detail, but and if you look at 3.4.2, which is the statement underneath, and you've got and a further 500 commenced, I think there should be 503 as well.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm sure there's going to be some sort of government nerd that's going to pick up on this, so I thought I might start off by doing that.
Thank you.
One thing that isn't in here, unless I missed it, because you make quite a reference to the COVID-19 pandemic, and totally understand that. But in 2022, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which sent energy costs through the roof. I work in the construction sector, and price increases were going up double digits and then some during that period. And I would have expected to have seen something like that, because certainly from a lot of a house building point of view, their balanced costs would probably have been unviable, at least during that 2022 to 2023 period, in which that the report is actually referring to. Company I work for normally has a nominal 5% price increase per annum. We were going up 10 and 15% more or less every other month during that period. And we are no different to a lot of other construction markets, and I would suggest that that should feature somewhere in this report, unless I've completely missed it.
Yeah, so we don't reference the Ukraine invasion specifically, but in paragraph 3.8.2, which is under the viability heading, it talks about COVID, as you said, and said that build costs remain high despite the impacts of COVID-19 having largely subsided. So we do acknowledge that build costs are still high. I don't know if you are looking for specific reference to the Ukraine invasion.
Well, again, because I work in that sector, I would slightly disagree with what you've actually put there. The pandemic would have had an impact on operations, because obviously it's going to slow the building. But during that period, and I'm talking from my company, and I work for a global organisation, we only had a 4.5% price increase, which would have been a nominal price increase at the beginning of that year when COVID struck. So our pricing would have remained stable throughout the first year of the COVID pandemic. It's the following year, 2022, when those costs went significantly higher. And I would suspect that those people that might have got planning permission for developments during that COVID period would have been looking to start commencing probably late 2021, early 2022. And that's when the cost viabilities of construction materials, because it was down to the Ukraine war and the impact on energy costs, would have skyrocketed. So I think you're probably lumping too much into that, and I think there are two things that would have factored quite significantly there, with that one being the second one.
I think I was looking at it as a shortage of materials sort of increased prices, because there was shortage of bricks, that kind of thing, during COVID. I was in the development industry during that time, so myself.
Yeah, okay. I'm not going to die in a ditch over this, Chairman, but the cost of manufacture requires an energy, and I work albeit I'm a specialist, predominantly in sort of the insulation industry, if you like. That requires basically melting glass. We're still melting glass during the pandemic because you have to keep that factory operational. If you switch off, it's like steel mills. If you switch it off, you lose the manufacturing facility completely. But our costs, because it's a high energy intensive marketplace, as is things like manufacturing bricks, etc., would have been impacted by significant double-digit price increases during 2022. I'm trying to be helpful here and give you a reason as to why this might have impacted it, basically.
I think it's very useful. Thank you, Councillor Bosher. I think what we can do is obviously those issues are captured in here, just not in the detail you're talking. So when we say build costs remain high, despite COVID-19 had an impact, other things have kept build costs high in 3.8.2, and again in 3.12.2 we highlight the changing market conditions as one of those barriers for large-scale street site allocations. We can add some wording, Chair, with your consent, to highlight, because it obviously the energy impacts are one, building material availability is another. Some of that is energy, some of that is other global factors as well. So we can add some additional wording around that.
Personally, I'd look at 3.8.2 and perhaps add a line in there about the increased energy costs were going to be impacting on raw material manufacture.
What I would propose we do is add both increased energy and increased building costs, because there are several other building costs that have maintained high inflation that aren't in energy intensive sectors, timber being an obvious example. But we can add a line to say absolutely, it just follows on nicely in 3.8.2, and we maybe add something to 3.12.2 as well to flesh that out.
Yeah, certainly, because if you look at 3.9.4, it talks about the pandemic is on the wane, and now we're moving out of it. And I appreciate we're looking at that period, and we're now moving forward. But again, if you're manufacturing and building homes and homes materials, the viability costs of a scheme probably set in 2020, 2021, something like that, are going to be based on your key product costs. Now, going back to it, 2022, when we were going up, and I think as a company, we put our prices up by the thick end of about 35% during that period in tranches. And we were no different to a lot of the others. If former Councillor Scott Pater-Harris was here, who works in that industry as well, he'd probably be saying something very similar. We haven't cut our prices by that margin since energy prices have come down. So I would imagine that costs are still significantly higher than perhaps developers actually budgeted for at the early stages of it. Now, yes, they might build those houses and pass on that cost to whoever's looking to purchase it, but it probably also makes, in some instances, makes the scheme not quite as viable for them, because they want their margins as perhaps it would have been pre-2020, I would imagine, if we go back that far.
If I may, John, I think it's a really useful background, so certainly flesh out those two paragraphs, as I say, with that. Just as a general point, just to respond to that, obviously the housing market in particular is an unusual commercial market, as it can't do, as you've just described, pass on its build costs to consumers, because obviously the new build housing market is such a tiny fraction of the housing market. Unlike other consumption, where you're only consuming new things, the second-hand housing market is obviously significantly larger, and consequently prices set by the second-hand housing market, not that. Hence viability, hence the problem, because if builders could just pass on the costs of increased build costs to the purchaser, that wouldn't prevent housing being built. The problem is they can't pass those costs on, because they would then not be competitive with the second-hand market, hence they're not building.
But you can certainly see it locally. I mean, if I look at it locally, and we've got a development going up, all right, it's in Bedhampton. People probably know it's the Strawberry Fields near the Rusty Cutter A3 roundabout. So it's not strictly Portsmouth. Well, not yet it isn't, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. But that was meant to be all developed in one go. they developed half of it, and then they sat on the rest of the land, so you could argue a bit of land banking, and they're only in the process of actually developing the second bit some 2.5 years later. Now, the original plan was to do the whole thing all in one go, because certainly from where I sit as a ward councillor, the immediate impact of such a big development happening right on our doorstep was clearly going to have a major impact, particularly as they were marketing Solent Road and Springfield as the schools of choice to go to, even if they weren't in that local authority. So we had our own problems, which is why we kept it very, very close, if you see what I mean. But again, I think there needs to be a reference to increased energy costs. How you word that is entirely up to you, but you know, it was something that we certainly had in 2022.
Yes, I think it certainly would be helpful if points such as that, they could be added to the final document.
The other one, and Russell may have a lot more, but the other one I picked up on, because I've flicked through it, and a lot of it makes perfect sense to me in that respect, is 3.1.1, and bullet point 2, barriers to delivery on sites identified as part of the 5-year housing programme, land supply such as land banking scheme viability, affordable housing requirements, infrastructure and utilities provision, involvement of statutory consultees, etc. That says everything to me. Everything's been a factor. Do we have a major issue with land banking in Portsmouth? We don't.
This that bullet point is a quote from the planning practice guidance. So this says what we're supposed to look at. So we're supposed to look at all these things in case they are an issue.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they are here.
Doesn't mean that they are.
Yeah.
So, right, fair enough. I get where you're coming from on that one. And you mentioned the new local plan. Any idea when that's likely to hit our desks?
Well, the addendum is due to be consulted on in winter this year.
Winter this year?
Yeah,
Right.
for adoption in 2027.
2027.
It all depends really on the ministry, whether they bother to respond to communications from us.
Well, judging by their current track record, Chairman, I suspect probably not.
Precisely.
And perhaps, without wanting to go down that particular rabbit hole, this is obviously for Portsmouth. If we go down the devolution route going forward, that's probably going to significantly change this sort of report going forward, I'm guessing, because we will have everybody else's figures coming into our figures, will we?
No.
No.
I'm being pedantic. It's really important, and I do it 10 times a day. That's local government reorganisation you're talking about.
Yeah,
not
local
devolution.
government reorganisation. Yeah.
In local government reorganisation, depending on how the cake is cut and what local authority is operative in South East Hampshire, yes, that new local authority will need to look at its own housing delivery. Some of our neighbours who we may be colleagues with rather than neighbours to are having similar struggles to meet their housing needs, Havant being an obvious example. Others are over-providing for housing and having indeed signed statements of common ground with us to help us meet our housing need, Fareham, Winchester. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Overall, yes, there will still be a housing delivery challenge in South East Hampshire, not the land constraint problem that is a Portsmouth, probably the best example. Gosport haven't similar problems, but probably the best example will be diluted, which is positive. But those other broader problems, those viability problems, etc., there are some areas in South East Hampshire, Fareham and Winchester, that have better viabilities, but Havant and Gosport, for example, would have similarly challenging viabilities. If we're then talking about the Isle of Wight, South East Hampshire, other areas, they all bring their own pros and cons into that mix. But yeah, a new local authority will need to look at a new housing delivery test. And if it fails that housing delivery test, which is entirely plausible, it would then obviously need to produce its own housing delivery test action plan.
Thanks, Chairman.
Councillor Simpson.
Very short, actually, in comparison to Mr. Councillor Bosher. I think really, I mean, having looked through it, obviously, it doesn't help, obviously, that it is, obviously, I want to say kind of old data in some sense, because obviously we've got a new government as well, so a lot of things are going to change, which are quite inevitable. You know, we're talking about the revisiting of housing income with land availability at 4.2. I mean, we had a lovely meeting yesterday which talked about the new working paper, not a white paper as it should be called, talking about how we approach planning, and yeah, it's very interesting. I'm not sure how it will completely work, but it is after all only a kind of a consultation. It might be worth having a look at, Councillor Bosher. It's very different. But other than that, really, it's, you know, I expect us to have a very different action plan probably next year. Thank you.
I have a few minor questions on this. 3.2.1, the thing which is very noticeable in Table 3 is the very high number of cases where permission has lapsed. It was obviously high in 21-22, but also it was quite high in 22-23. What is the reason that, so as you can see, for the lapsed permissions?
That is a very high number of dwellings with permission that have lapsed here, so it's not 160 permissions in 21-22, it's a number of dwellings. Right. The nature of Portsmouth housing, of course, is a lot of it is platted based. If you have a single scheme that lapses, it could be 50, 70 flats, and obviously that would have a big impact, whereas an eight units could be one plan permission, 160 could be one or two plan permissions. So unfortunately, the nature of the reporting we do, this is all about housing unit delivery, so that can mask the actual facts of the number of consents that have lapsed. As we've talked about at length and helpfully with Councillor Bosher, viability is a major problem. Yes. And the planning department has done a lot of good work. This is a few years ago, so but certainly continues to do good work to get planning permissions produced and available to the market, where the market cannot react to delivering those planning permissions, and that is lapsed. That they therefore lapse is an unfortunate product. It has been referenced earlier, there is current government consultation on improving the speed of build out, and in there government is I think finally recognising that land banking is not really a major issue, something the industry's known for a long time, and actually stalled sites. And that's what we're talking here, sites that have gone through the process, are ready to go, but for some third-party reason, and for third-party refinance, in 99% of cases, I would suggest, they're unable to then move forward within the time period that plan permissions are granted. In the same point, and unique to Portsmouth, it was around this period, we don't have the key breakdown, but it was in this period, we were granting plan permissions on a 1-year time limit rather than the more normal 3-year time limit. That was necessitated by the nitrates issue to manage our nitrates bank and to ensure we had sufficient credits to sell to achieve neutrality. We couldn't have developers sitting on those credits for long periods of times. So we only gave them a 1-year. It's a use it or lose it kind of planning permission scenario. So if they couldn't bring their schemes forward, we would get those credits available back to us to sell on to another developer that could do it. So for a period of years, which will have fallen into this category, shorter plan permissions had to be granted, and that does mean you'll have a bit of a spike in lapses inevitably because of that.
Could a footnote just be put in to explain that we were only giving 1 year because of nitrates? It'd be useful to have that for future reference. Who knows who'll be reading this in 20 years' time. The other thing which might be useful to slightly expand upon for 20 years' time is the peculiarity which we find in 3.8.1 that although the government reckons that we have an inadequate housing supply and we need to build vast numbers of houses, and there is a demand for housing, which we know, that the house prices within this city remain low. This is something which Councillor Bosher has referred to in his speaking slightly earlier. Why are house prices so low in Portsmouth? Do we have any handle on that?
Yeah, long as a piece of string, really. So, no, we do not have an official position for that. Obviously, different parts of the country have very different housing markets. It's not just Portsmouth, because, as I say, our housing market is entwined, as again Councillor Bosher gave the practical example, with Havant and with Gosport. And there's obviously a series of issues that can impact on housing values there. Deprivation, we have some of the highest indices of multiple deprivation, abnormal to the South East as a whole. Issues such as crime and disorder, which actually isn't that bad in Portsmouth, to be clear, but they can impact on house values. And then perception and visual amenity and quality of space can have an impact. I don't think those last two are particular issues for Portsmouth, I must stress. But certainly that lower deprivation and consequently lower household incomes for residents will of course impact the ability for both the rental and ownership sector to cause price inflation to the same extent you will have seen elsewhere in the country. We do often, from an economic development context, call Portsmouth a northern city on the south coast, and there are a lot of parallels to draw with the nature of our industry and the educational attainment and aspiration that we see associated with that, which can work to suppress a housing market. But that housing market is such a complex ecosystem, I would be very loath to prescribe a reason. You could write a long thesis on it and just about scratch the surface, I would suggest.
Thank you. I suspected it would be a long thesis. Okay. Yes, the other area where we might be useful to have an update is on 4.5.2. How are these additional costs from the Future Home Standard and Accessible and Adaptable Standards are working their way through? Are they still having an effect? I agree this is an historical report, but what is the current effect of those?
Well, those are only relatively new, so those perhaps not really affecting things in this period, but they will be coming forward to affect us in the future.
Colleagues, any other questions from you? Right. Well,
Chair, if I may, just to be absolutely clear, then we will be making some changes. So rather than asking you to sign it off now, we will be changing our recommendation to delegate to officers. And obviously we can do that in consultation with you if you wish. We'll be making changes to 3.8.2 to specifically reference energy costs associated with the war in Ukraine, as an additional set of sentences to the end of that paragraph, and probably picking up again in 3.12 too, so it reads consistently. We will also be correcting the column, the row in table 5 and in 3.4.2. Actually, the fourth column also adds up to 602, not 597, so we'll correct that as well. So there's a couple of just arithmetic corrections there.
So I agree to note the content of the Housing Delivery Test Action Plan and to delegate to officers minor alterations which I will see before they are approved.
Yes.
Thank you. We now move on to the second item on our agenda today, which is a report on houses in multiple occupation, and that is your report, Ian. Will you be presenting?
I certainly can. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much.
You requested a report on houses in multiple occupation, HMOs, sort of general sort of state of the nation report when it comes to HMOs. So we've it doesn't drill in great depth into certain aspects of it. It is a planning services report, so there are obviously large areas in the private sector housing part of the council that deals with licensing HMOs, and obviously the growing additional licensing, which is a relatively new change to a notable increase in their workload and outputs, and obviously consequently that comprehensive mapping of all HMOs that were produced from that. So we don't drill into those matters, we stick to our lanes in planning, so to speak, for your portfolio. The report is laid out, we provide a background and definition on HMOs in section 3.1. I think in there I would flag a key matter which I think does cause a lot of confusion for people, which is the nature of those use class C3, B and C uses, which are uses that do allow people that are unrelated to live together, up to 6 of them, and not be an HMO, which I think does cause a degree of confusion. So we've highlighted that and put that, so if you will, into the public record through that national legislation. Section 3.2 describes the evolution of the existing and emerging policies on HMO and the basis and justification of one of the key matters we know is causing a lot of confusion with residents and members on the 10% threshold. We've also provided a legal opinion which we got back in 2024 from our KC, who's advising us on the local plan, which was a useful background basis on that 10% figure. Section 3.3 provides a short summary of the role of housing services, and within that I would really draw members' attention to paragraph 3.3.4, which has been provided to us by the Housing Department, which does highlight that real essential role HMOs have in managing the issues of temporary accommodation for homelessness. Noticing that in 2024-25 we used HMOs to help 250 people who would otherwise be homeless or threatened with homelessness by placing them into HMOs, and that is helping us to manage what is one of our top 3 budget pressures in that year, which if we weren't able to place people into HMOs to that extent, I won't say it would have caused the council to go bankrupt, but I'm not sure I would be exaggerating if I did. So do bring that to members' attention. And then finally, section 3.4, we cover off current decision making, and this is a summary of appeal performance against decisions made in respect of HMOs and key takeaways from appeal decisions and cost claims that have been awarded against the council over the last couple of years. That's the overall executive summary of the report. Obviously happy to take any questions of its content.
Questions? Councillor Bosher? Councillor Simpson?
Well, you know I had. So anyway, some of it's going to be from yesterday, but I went through the report a little bit more in depth. Obviously, some very interesting observations and opinions in this update, which I thank the Planning Department for addressing. However, and this might have been in the previous report, but I thought I'd bring it up anyway. A couple of concerns, which doesn't seem to be, is with the HMO register. I don't know if you had done it in a previous report, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because it is something that's mentioned by members and by residents nearly every planning committee. I mean, especially in the last 2 or 3, not the one just gone, but before that, where essentially illegal and operating HMOs were mentioned. Some where previous planning chair would not include, obviously he wouldn't include, but somewhere the chair would want to include, but failed in both essentially. Which then comes to the amounts of HMOs currently without licence. You did mention this anyway, but I thought I'd bring it up again. But have Planning Commission yet reports they are operating? A bit of an issue in itself there. At point 3.2.3, it mentions about the council SPDs being reviewed after 5 years in 2017, and then I believe reviewed 2 years later in 2019. No review in 6 years. Obviously why, and is it possible to add further SPDs? I could maybe leave that question come back later. I'm glad you mentioned about the C3Bs, because I was going to mention at 3.2.4 further revision to the SPD in 2018 over sandwiching 3 in a row. However, there has been an example of where there has been a C3B which has created then a 3 in a row, but because you don't class as an HMO, it still doesn't get away from the fact that it is a house of multiple occupation, and obviously that adds quite a lot of confusion, I think definitely for residents, but also frustration because they feel that it should be. I mean, maybe there could be a suggestion of an officer in charge to annually audit with planning, licensing and housing department so that it can run smoother, but also avoid those situations and confusions. That might be an idea. That would obviously also help with the licensings being a lot slower compared to the planning permissions given. I like the research of 3.2.9, very interesting, worth revisiting at some point. I saw that we compare Portsmouth with other councils, but I still believe it's hard to compare with a high densely populated island city. You know, we're the only one in fact. So while I can understand we have to compare it to something, I kind of feel that we're never really going to have a complete accurate comparison to our city. I do agree that there was no clear majority of the 10% threshold among the groups and parties. At 3.3.3, we discussed this. I know you're going to agree to disagree on this one, Ian, but I'm going to mention anyway. Agreed it is a low-cost housing option compared to a one-bedroom flat. A one-bedroom flat's about 1,100. But with some HMOs costing up to £900 a month now, I would disagree it's cheap or low in cost anymore. In short, it's gone up greatly. And that isn't just information I've just plucked. I've actually done a bit of research too. On 3.4.1, mentions about call-ins, and it goes into details. And I'm fully aware, and I think we're all fully aware of residents, I suppose, really just want to be heard. And I think that's what it really comes down to. It's becoming more and more often, I'm even being asked, and other councils are being asked to look at HMO applications that are not even in my ward. That was definitely not something I had when I first started, but in the last year or two, it's become more and more, more and more often. So it might be worth noting that it's people just want to be heard. With the 3.4.6, it was to do with the number of cases being referred. Now, so basically the situation is resulting in significant cost in both time and resource due to the number of cases being referred to the planning committee. Now, I got to mention that I remember Gerald on multiple occasions on planning committee saying, that it was basically something they had put in place. I assume the administration put in place so that they could be brought and judged on each individual merit. So I mean, I think it's very important to mention that obviously it's significant cost, but it was something that the administration suggested to happen. And to finish off, under 3.4.8, it is unfortunate the government inspector does overturn our committee's decisions, and this report shows why they tend to, which is very informative, and I thank you very much for giving that information. I just wanted to, I know this was a short report, but I just wanted to highlight just a few things just to give a little bit more understanding to the planning department. Thank you.
I'm not sure there were any questions in there, but I can deal with each of those points as we go. Well, so I'll deal with each point. So the register, as I said, private sector housing is going through that additional licensing. We await that mapping, which is obviously the up-to-date list of every HMOs. As members who saw or were attending yesterday's planning committee, they would have seen that obviously, and I think a very eloquent applicant for certificate of lawfulness, highlighting that there are many, I think he used the description thousands, it's probably hundreds rather than thousands, but I wouldn't want to argue that we don't know from the planning department yet, of very historical shared houses that when they came through many years ago weren't HMOs, because that wasn't the definition. The law changed as laid out in the report. So they've never come through the planning process and thus aren't forming part of any planning register, but have been added to registers as the licensing process has picked those up, which is the case for the larger licensing. Now we have additional licensing again, is the case for all HMOs, including smaller HMOs. So once that process is complete and properly mapped, that will provide a comprehensive register. As it stands, we have a register. Not particularly a fan of that name because it is not comprehensive. Something I've said in this room more times than I care to remember. It is one of the many resources available. Obviously, talking to neighbours where we have a need to do that from a planning perspective is a key part of each planning application that comes forward. Inspecting sites where there is any accusation that there is an HMO that is unaware, that hasn't been picked up from our records. Council tax information, updates and confirmation of the exact position known from private sector housing, input from ward members are all tools used to ensure that when we bring things to the planning committee, they are 100% accurate from the information available to the council at the time the recommendation is made, and I stand by that argument, and I don't know of any cases where that's not been the case. Very occasionally at the committee meeting someone pops up and says actually number X is an HMO and that's never been mentioned before. I can't stop someone doing that, and indeed if that is an HMO unaware to the council tax department, the housing department or the planning department, or indeed to the ward members who have been consulted specifically on that HMO application, then we should look at it. It is frustrating that it does happen in the 11th hour, but if it is a true concern, then it's obviously one that requires validation. So that's the register. So it's a private sector housing piece of work to take that forward through the licensing issue, and I hope that work will be completed as soon as it can be. So an ongoing challenge, but not something I have any concerns is adversely affecting decision making despite accusations to the contrary. Review of the SPD. So most of your SPDs are much older than 6 years. I think this is the last SPD that was reviewed. Your policies are 2012. There is no change to the SPD because the SPD explains policy. There is nothing about the policy that is unclear. In 2017 and 19, there were elements of the policy that were unclear. People weren't quite sure how to understand applications for an increase in intensity, changing a 5-bed HMO to a 10-bed HMO. There was nothing in there to help guide the interpretation of policy. So that was added in 2019, and a few very minor changes, I should say, in 2019, as laid out in the report, were needed. I'm unaware of any changes to policy guide to explaining the policy interpretation that have been needed. The way policy was interpreted in 2019 is the same way we advise you should interpret policy in 2025. So consequently, there is no need to update that SPD. The emerging plan, of course, takes some of that interpretive information out of the SPD and places it into the new emerging HMO policy itself. Sandwiching, 10% rule, etc., would be directly in the policy. At that point, we could get rid of the SPD altogether, or we can keep it and refine it and update it to better reflect the new policy. I think the current thinking would, of course, be looking to get rid of the SPD altogether because it would be referring to PCS 20 rather than the new PLP, whatever number it will be, probably 20 again, I think, to go that. So straight away it will appear out of date. So it will need to be republished and tidied up if we are to keep it, though its use and utility may be significantly less. There are some useful guidance notes in there and illustrations to help practitioners and interested stakeholders. So we may well want to keep something, but clearly there would be no purpose in producing that in the last 6 years. C3B, to move on to that, a statement just to be absolutely clear, your Councillor Simpson, you incorrectly stated C3B are a house of multiple occupancy. They are not, that is the key point. Everyone here, when you go home, unless you live in an HMO at the moment, if you want tomorrow to use your house as a C3B, you can do. We have no control over that. As a city council, it is the law. It's not a permitted development right we can look to control or trade. It is just a fundamental use. In the same way you can decide whether you're going to have bangers and mash or chicken salad for dinner, what you do in your own home is your business. We can't control it. And consequently, we can't, despite it has some similarities to an HMO, say it's an HMO and control it, because every single house in Portsmouth could be used in use class C3B or use class C3C. We cannot stop that, so clearly it falls out with the control of HMOs. 3.2.9, you suggested that there was no comparison to Portsmouth as a dense island city. The comparisons we provided are those authorities that have successfully or unsuccessfully sought to have a abnormal control of HMOs. Most, as we've laid out in detail in several reports, including this one, most authorities in the country don't control HMOs at all. Say those that do, the minority, the majority of that minority use a very similar methodology as us. A couple have tried to add that more stringent issue, the 5% being the practical example. The only ones with any sort of success are very different in their impacts, and we've detailed those in great length there, and they are practical and I think useful examples, highly applicable to Portsmouth, and I can expand on that if that is necessary. So where, for example, the West Lancs plan has a 5% and a lesser control, that is on very specific roads around in a relatively small town with a very large student population. So where they were worried that that was going to be an issue. So if you wanted a highly different policy, the council has decided it doesn't, it wants 10%, that's in the plan as emerging. We could have done that with a lot more work and a lot more officer time and money needed to produce something together and find those roads where there is a problem and apply a percentage to that. I'm not sure that would have achieved the goals that residents and ward members have raised as a concern, however, because at the moment our strategy obviously is looking at roads that aren't as much of a problem. They are well below 10% often in the 2, 3, 4% areas. The other examples in there have been areas which have a massive overabundance of single person occupation already, and they've sought to control it unsuccessfully, in fact. But that control, again, if we wanted to look at that same as philosophical approach, that would apply down in the that South Sea, that St Jude's ward, that Central South Sea ward, that would be a separate degree of control there rather than a universal policy for the whole of the city. So again, wasn't one in discussions with the administration and indeed in discussion with all members in the 13 meetings and working groups we did over the last couple of years, was shown to be a preference. So I think they are very useful comparisons that explain how the policy has evolved. Paragraph 3.3.3, the low cost housing option. HMOs are our lowest cost housing option. The policy does not state they're cheap. It is simply the lowest cost housing option available in Portsmouth or indeed anywhere. 3.4.1, you rest with some concerns around call-ins. I'm not sure what question you had there, but happy to deal with it if that is the case.
I think it was just more of a statement that it's not as black and white as it seems, written down of like, well, you know, some people are deciding to blanket, you know, to put in essentially objections to HMOs. I think there doesn't seem to be a better way for residents to express how unhappy they are with the HMO policies that we have in place. And then I was also adding to the fact that it mentioned about essentially members, i.e. councillors, calling them in, and I'm just highlighting that we're in a situation where we are elected to represent residents, and sometimes you're getting residents not even from the wards, so other wards, that are asking for help as well as contacting their own ward councillors. So it's not like what I'm trying to say is there does seem to be people who are very unhappy and they want to be heard. So I fully understand that you have observed it, but I just want you to know that there is a bit of background to that.
Yeah, so I think to be clear, the statement of fact in 3.4.1, the three factors that bring things to planning committee are the number of objections, 6 or more will bring a positive recommendation to planning committee. The second is a direct call-in, which obviously could be based on concerns raised by objectors, either a large number or indeed a small number that do not feel they're able to otherwise make a representation for whatever reason, and indeed the blanket call-in, which I'll come into a second. I would just say on that second point, I think it's valid to have, we do have an unfortunate number of examples where it doesn't appear that there is any local concern. There are no other objections or a very low number of objections, but it is nevertheless called in by a member, and we can't see what the reasoning for that is. Obviously, ward members can in effect be the deputy of a resident that feels unable to do it. Might be through to an issue with IT literacy or language or availability, or it may be something that is making them feel unable to make those comments. That's different to calling it in. Obviously, helping someone have their voice heard is a representation on a planning application, and ward members absolutely serve that useful and essential purpose in the planning process to enable things to enable people that are unable to articulate their own concerns for whatever reason to articulate it into the planning process. That doesn't be the same as call-in. That is a separate matter where members have said exceptionally this needs a broader discussion rather than ensuring that their voice is heard and added in, and we are seeing a number of those, which is a concern, I would say, as a practical management of the overall work of the council. The final third practical example in there is, of course, the blanket call-in, and that takes us on to 3.4.6, where you suggested that what we call the blanket call-in, which is a call-in by Councillor Gerald Vernon-Jackson for all applications that involve an increase in occupancy of only one and otherwise have no other grounds for development. That is not an administration plan, as I suggested there. That is a call-in by a single councillor. We would normally expect a councillor to call in applications individually. In that case, Councillor Vernon-Jackson called in a series of applications individually on a couple of cases, and it was clear from the vote of the committee that, and indeed we saw it yesterday, where again the vote of the committee, there's a notable majority that wish to apply their judgment in a way that I would say more often than not has always determined, other than one exception, that a change from 6 to 7 or 7 to 8 does require planning permission, and consequently I took the choice to say, well, rather than making Councillor Vernon-Jackson call each and every one of these in hereafter, as it's clear where the committee's opinion is, and I've been keeping a careful eye on committee voting, and if that had started to notably change and the majority of the committee was no longer supporting that direction, I would have said, well, okay, let's stop calling those in automatically, but that hasn't been the case, and it is still a notable majority of the committee do come to that conclusion on each and every one of those cases.
I want to just correct you there a little bit. Just that, and you'll remember this because you sat near enough all the planning committees in 2022 and beginning of 2023. Gerald near enough called them all in, and it wasn't just a handful. He actually called in. I mean, what would you have at some point? 6 to 7. I think it was 6 to 7 every planning committee every 2 weeks in 2022, and a majority of them. Yeah. Yes, what I'm trying to say is you said only like a couple or a handful, but Gerald, he actually brought all of them in.
To be clear, what I said was Councillor Vernon-Jackson called in half a dozen individually, and it was clear where the committee's mind was. So I made the decision as the chief planner to extend that, and it is his call-in, but rather than making him do the admin of doing all of them, over 80 cases, as detailed in the report, were then brought to planning committee because planning committee clearly wished to make that, contrary to officers' advice, that judgment, a change of 6 to 7 required planning permission. So it wasn't, your statement was it was an administration decision. It wasn't. It was a Gerald Vernon-Jackson choice as a member, which I then enacted on behalf of the council. Then you said you PINs, overturns and 3.4.8. Again, I wasn't sure what your question on that point was.
More of just a statement. If any residents are watching it, I'd tell them to read the report. I think it's very interesting, and thank you for submitting it.
Right, a couple of minor questions from me. 3.1.3, 3.1.4. We looked, you mentioned there C3Bs. Were a house in multiple occupation to become a C3B for any reason, would it have to apply once again if it were to wish to revert to be an HMO?
Yes, just to be clear for anyone watching on the basis, obviously the Article 4 direction detailed in the report permit the right that all other householders have in most other parts of the country to convert their C3 dwelling house to a C4 HMO. You can do that. I can do that where I live outside of Portsmouth, for example, without a need for planning permission. In Portsmouth, that is needed. To go the other way, to convert your C4 HMO into a C3 dwelling house, that is permitted development. You do not need planning permission to do so. Because this Article 4 direction was brought in to prevent that C3 to C4 change, lots of properties, and we are talking dozens, if not hundreds, of the city, made a specific application to seek what is often colloquially called a dual-use site. Actually, it's a planning permission to be either a C3 or C4. That enables them, for a period of 10 years, separate permitted development right, from the grant of that planning permission to switch back and forth. So effectively they have the permitted development right that every other household doesn't have, because they've specifically been judged, and effectively this is given, say, yes, you can be an HMO, but no, to enable you to make those choices. And there are a few examples in the city, not many, it's not common, but they do that. They might be an HMO for a couple of years, and then if the market's changing, they'll switch over and rent out to a single household under C3, then they'll switch back to be an HMO if the market changes again. So those dual use ones do exist. In those cases, if they went from a C4 to a C3, they would, or C3B, C3A, B or C, they would be able to switch back from a C to a C4 under their dual use planning permission that lasts for 10 years. Other C4s that just have a straight C4 planning permission or a sui generis planning permission to be operated as an HMO, once they convert into a C3 dwelling house, they have no permitted development right to convert back, whether that's C3, A, B, C, no permitted development right to convert back in, or expressed planning permission right to convert back into a C4 HMO.
Thank you for that clarity. And the only other point I would make is to my colleague Councillor Simpson, 3.4.1 on decision making. I advise you to have a look at what was published by the Ministry yesterday in terms of planning committees. And if you feel that that is unsatisfactory, as perhaps I do, to make a representation. That, I think, concludes that part of the entertainment. I therefore what am I supposed to do with this?
It is for information only, Chair.
It's for information only. It can be, therefore, it is a public document and can be used as you wish. So that is for information. That's accepted for information. That concludes this morning's entertainment at 4 minutes to midday. Thank you very much for your attendance and for the courtesy shown.